All right, gentlemen, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So my name's Randall Isenhour. I'm a content manager for the SDK and the MSDN websites, developer centers, and things for SharePoint products. And this also includes the Windows SharePoint Services technology, as well as Office SharePoint Server, SharePoint Designer, and Project Server. So I'm very immersed in the server content world, and I'm joined today by Alex Malik, who's a PM on the SharePoint Designer side, and Mike Amerlon, who's a program manager on the Windows SharePoint Services side. So we're going to talk today about tools that we're making available to you, as well as documentation in the form of the SDK, and just the techniques and some of the tips that you're going to be able to go back after you've seen all this great content about features, all these great presentations. This is going to get kind of the nitty-gritty into how you would go back and implement these features and do some coding on your own in your test environments. There is a bit of a slant on this. There's a bit of a slant on this presentation toward the platform, but we are going to cover some. We are going to cover some Office SharePoint Services stuff in some of my demos, but we are going to focus primarily on the platform of Windows SharePoint Services. So we're going to talk today about getting set up with the development tools, the tools that you're going to need. You saw the slide in the keynote presentation yesterday from Bill Gates about sort of ranging from that designer role to the advanced developer who's going to be using Visual Studio. And so we're going to kind of cover that range of when you might use which tool. And in addition, we're going to talk a little bit about a codename Visual Studio Extensions for SharePoint Services, which is an add-in for Visual Studio that actually lets you create SharePoint projects, and we're going to talk a bit about that. Kurt Delbene announced it yesterday in his keynote as well, so we're going to do a demo of that. Then we're going to switch to Mike Amerlon and talk about scenarios for development and talk about some what-if analysis of when would you use which technology. And then I'm going to take back the reins and talk about, give you a sneak preview of the SDKs, all the work we've been doing there. I think we're very excited about all the Visual Studio integration we've been doing and a lot of the content that we hope will jumpstart your understanding of some of these concepts that need to be sat down with and looked at really closely. And then we're going to go back to the web and talk about the MSDN Office Developer Center and show you a preview of the resources we're going to put up there, and also some of the community resources we want to start taking advantage of. So getting set up, you're going to need Visual Studio 2005 to do some of your advanced development. You're going to need Office SharePoint Designer 2007. And you're going to need, you're not going to need, but I think after you see the Visual Studio extensions for SharePoint Services, you're really going to want to install this on your system as well. And this also gives you the ability to create XSDs that will help you create schemas. And then basically from there you need to go out and grab the SDKs from MSDN, and we're going to be, of course, providing those for free as downloads on MSDN. And the first preview of that's going to be at Beta 2 on MSDN. Okay. So some of the scenarios where you might use Visual Studio, that would be things like writing event handlers, writing custom workflows, creating custom web services, writing custom web parts, and writing BDC metadata. And I'll give an example of this custom BDC metadata in a couple of slides to show you sort of how you would use the SDK to write one of those metadata web parts. So now I'm going to hand it over to Alex, and he's going to talk a bit about SharePoint Designer. And so I'll hand it over to Alex.
Hey, can everyone hear me? Cool. So, afternoon all. My name is Alexander Malik, and I've been asked to talk to you for a few minutes about some of the tools we're building in Office 2007 to make your lives as developers easier. Pretty excited about the stuff we're building, and hopefully some of it will resonate with you. how do I click next? There we go. Yeah. So in my day job, I'm a PM a program manager on the SharePoint Designer team. SharePoint Designer is a new product in Office 2007, and it's built on, I guess, the best parts of FrontPage 2003, specifically the SharePoint support that we've been building over the last few releases. If you're familiar with FrontPage as it relates to SharePoint, the value we offered in previous releases is page customization support. So we had great WYSIWYG remote editing of SharePoint pages, and provided you're okay with the unghosting aspect. And we had the ability to do these simple applications through this web part that we delivered called the data view web part. And basically, the data view was an ASP control that allowed you to create reports against any data source, like XML data sources or line of business data sources. That's kind of the foundation we started SharePoint Designer with. And really, the reason we started a new product is so that we could solely focus on building a great tool for rapid application development for the SharePoint platform, all the SharePoint server SKUs. So the investments we've made this release kind of fall into three buckets. We've done a lot more work around page editing, page customization. We have some great tools for CSS customization. So basically, if you're familiar with Dreamweaver and they have great CSS support, we have parity functionality, so you can do, you have professional quality tools for doing your page editing. That might not be as interesting to you as developers. What is interesting, or what might be interesting, I guess, is our data view support, which we've spent a lot of our kind of dollars this release investing in. So last release, we made it possible to create these web page reports or views of any data source. And this release, we've done a tremendous amount of investment in allowing you to do both read and write scenarios. So now, without doing any programming, you can create forms against SQL data, against line of business data, SharePoint lists. So now that you have views and you have forms, you can more easily build up simple applications, and you can use lists as your data source. So that was one of our big investments. And then another one of our big investments was in the area of workflow. So workflow is a new piece that's in the SharePoint platform. The Windows SharePoint Services team, they hosted the Windows Workflow Foundation workflow framework that Microsoft recently has been working on. And the SharePoint Designer team invested in I guess, a tool to make it really easy to create simple workflows. And I'll show you a screenshot of that in a second. So as a developer, the way we think, or we'd like you to think of SharePoint Designer is as a tool that's, I guess, another tool in your arsenal, something that you can use to solve some simple scenarios when Visual Studio might be too much effort. So for example, with our data view feature, you can create these rich reporting kind of portals with using things like web part connections, so you have part-to-part communication. Something like this you can build basically in about half an hour, where this might be coming from an SAP data source or Microsoft CRM, something like that. So, and because the data view is built on the standardized language XSLT, even if our designer doesn't take you kind of as far as you want to go, you can go into code view, and we've invested in providing a better code view editing experience. So IntelliSense, and we have a cool dialog for building complicated XPath expressions. So even as a developer, you don't have to be using the design view. You can have a really great XSLT editing experience in our code view. And then the way workflow might be relevant to you as a developer is for simple scenarios where you might want to write an event handler, you can use workflow instead to add that business logic to your site. So the way workflow works in SharePoint is that workflows are attached to lists like they're run against a list item. So you can say a workflow runs every time a new item is added. So if you want to do a simple scenario, let's say you're building some kind of CRM app and you have like a leads list, like a list of leads, and you want to have it so that whenever a lead is marked, so that this lead is ready to be converted into an opportunity, I want to go create an item in the opportunities list. You could actually do that in like a minute in the SharePoint Designer workflow editor. And I've shown a screenshot of the experience. It's a rules-based editor where you have the concept of conditions and actions. And so if you have the time to play with B1TR, the Office build, you can kind of get a feel for what's possible with the workflow editor. So that's really what SharePoint Designer offers you to you as developers. It's another tool that makes hopefully you can use to make your life easier when you need to solve problems quickly. But in the end, you're going to want to be in Visual Studio if you're building real solutions. I guess to put it mildly, the experience of Visual Studio is a little painful today when you're working against SharePoint. Basically, there really isn't any native support when you boot up Visual Studio for creating the kind of entities you'd want on for your SharePoint server. So, that's something definitely that we've taken to heart. We feel that pain too when we're building our own applications in Visual Studio, but also because we feel really passionate that developers need, about making developers productive. So, as first steps towards improving that situation, we started up a team about a year ago. Right now, we're calling it the Visual Studio Extensions for SharePoint Services. But basically, we want to address the biggest pain points that you as Visual Studio developers have when working on SharePoint. So, really, in our first iteration, the thing we're aiming to deliver is, in its simplest form, a project type in Visual Studio. So you can boot Visual Studio, and you can, you see the things that you'd expect to be able to build on SharePoint. You'd, expect to be able to build a web part and an event handler. We won't get all the entities, but we'll get the ones that are kind of biggest bang for the buck, item templates. So really, if, this is for the developer who wants to build site definitions and features, if you're familiar with the new SharePoint solution framework. And it isn't just about having templates. It's also about reducing the pain around the common things as a developer you need to do. You want to debug. And today, if you want to debug a web part you've written for SharePoint, you've got to manually copy it into the GAC or set your output path or something. It's not an F5, just debug, let me debug experience. So we're trying to deliver that. And also, you're going to need to do some XML editing. For example, if you're doing hand editing of camel. So we'll have the XSDs there. So this will be a download. That'll be the form that this comes in. A second thing we're looking at really seriously, and we're not quite ready to commit to it in V1, but it's something we feel is really important, is a tool that allows you to point at a site, so a site in the database, something maybe you've customized with SharePoint Designer, and export it to a site definition. So the scenario that this would really enable is you get your site looking all nice, like the presentation aspects of it, and you can use the great WYSIWYG tools that you get in SharePoint Designer and in the browser. And then you can bring up this utility, point out your site, and say, hey, give me serialize that to a site definition, so that I can open it up in Visual Studio and then add some custom web parts. So hopefully it'll really reduce the cost around doing the page editing aspects of building a completely custom site definition. So the type of widgets or entities that we want you to be able to create in V1 are web part, event handler, workflow activity, and then we'll have some basic support for creating site definitions and list definitions. So you have a project, and it'll have the right XML files that correspond to either of those, like the list, some basic list schema, and then you'll have IntelliSense for editing it by hand. Now, I was going to show a screenshot, but we actually have an alpha build that I can show you to give you a better idea of exactly what the experience will be like when we ship. Let's see here. Oh, yeah. Which is the mouse here? Oh, right. Forgot I got to use the laptop. Okay. So just take a second while I reestablish terminal server connection. So I'm going to boot up Visual Studio. So this add-in that we're writing for Visual Studio is targeted Visual Studio 2005. And what it'll give you after you install it is you'll be able to go into the new project dialog, and you'll see there's a SharePoint node in there. Applause, please. And we'll have more than web part, but in this alpha build, web part is the first one we kind of wanted to get working end to end. So, like I said, you'll be able to have event handler and workflow activity also. So I'll just actually use that default name. So I click OK, and I call this the non-demo because everything you're going to be like, wasn't it always like that? Fortunately, it wasn't, but hopefully when you see it, you'll be like, oh yeah, that all makes sense. So you get a new project. There's a default.cs file in there. We've done some work. So integrated into the project system is the concept of the solution that's going to be created for SharePoint. So if you're familiar at all with the WSP technology, or really the solution framework, this is corresponding to, I guess, the XML files that will be generated, so that SharePoint knows how to deploy the assembly. Anyway, so it's just, the reason I'm showing you is so that you don't have to hand code these XML files. So basically, I'm just going to show you the Hello World scenario because other than that, we're talking about just regular ASP.NET development. So I'll just make a quick change to this file. I'll call it my Hello World. I hit save. And now I'm going to do the unthinkable. I'm going to hit F5. And I'm going to start talking while it goes and works in the background. But basically, what we're doing now is all the things you would have had to do by hand. We're compiling the assembly. We're actually packaging it up into a WSP solution. We are calling the SharePoint object model and saying, hey, deploy that solution, activate that solution, add it into the webpark gallery. And then we're also going to attach to the SharePoint process so that you can immediately start debugging. And that should be possible in just a second. So basically, it's all the things you would have had to have done by hand, we're now doing automatically for you. So we automatically bring up the browser. We set the default start path for the project to be, I guess, the local host, but you can change that. So now I can come in and go edit page. I can say add a web part, and in the web part gallery will be my new web part. I think I've run into a SharePoint bug. Oh. I think maybe it terminals. Oh, let's try that one more time. There we go. So in here I have my part, and I can just add it, and I have my Hello World. And just to prove that it's real, and that wasn't like a part that was already there, because I could have done that. We never cheat demos, I swear. I'm going to put a breakpoint there and try to add it again. Hopefully this will actually work. Yay, okay. So that's really all I was going to demo. I mean, you get the idea. So for event handlers, you'll have the exact same experience. We'll do the right thing. We'll deploy it, and you can just focus as a developer on writing the code. So really, that was the two things I wanted to talk about. How SharePoint Designer's, just another tool in your arsenal as a developer, can help you in certain scenarios where maybe writing code is where you don't have time to write a full-fledged solution. And then otherwise, these tools are coming to make your life easier. This first release, so the new project types, the goal is to have them at the RTM date. So around the time that you can get Office kind of in the stores, you'll be able to get this off MSDN. And then the download tool, or the export tool that allows you to point at a site and export a site definition, that we're also trying to get in V1, and we're working hard to make that happen. And then after that, we'll see what we can improve beyond these basic kind of just bread and butter things that we should have been able to do already. All right, so now on to Mike. Just shut this down.
Hey, good afternoon. I think some of you might have attended my talks yesterday on the SharePoint platform and talking about ASP.NET. So now I'm going to cover a little bit about, these Visual Studio extensions are really great. When I first saw some of those F5 experiences, having worked a lot with SharePoint, it pretty much brought me to tears, except for the fact that you could basically do it for everything else that you'd ever want to develop against. But in the meantime, you've got this beta 2 in your hands, and you want to start developing with it. And the Visual Studio extensions for Windows SharePoint Services, those aren't available yet. How do you get started developing with Visual Studio against SharePoint? I'm going to cover a few tips and tricks I use. In fact, I'm sure a lot of you actually know these tips and tricks. Some of you have better tips and tricks. But this is what gets me through it. I want to show you a little bit of an example, and you'll have a little bit of a feel for what's involved in creating a SharePoint solution if you don't have those Visual Studio extensions. So to begin with, if you wanted to use Visual Studio to write code, you're going to want to start with the base project or the class library project for developing Visual Studio. You're going to want to use these because they basically allow you to write code if you need it, write an event receiver, write a web part definition, those sorts of things. But even if you're just doing a pure XML-based solution, starting with the class library project at least gets you into Visual Studio and allows you to use a lot of the great facilities that Visual Studio has, XML editing, those sorts of things. There's an arsenal of command line tools you're also going to want to get acquainted with as you develop SharePoint. GAC-UTIL is for putting things into the global assembly cache. This ships with the .NET Framework SDK, I believe it is. SDS-ADM is the administrator command line. But as a developer, SDS-ADM is your key to doing things like creating sites, or adding features, or deploying solutions. And finally, there's IIS Reset. IIS Reset is the control alternate delete of SharePoint. Sometimes as a developer, some things don't work the way it should. You're going to need to use IIS Reset to go ahead and restart the server. I'll go into a little bit of the cases where you would need it. It's not totally superstitious that you should use IIS Reset, but that is something you should have in your repository. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the XSDs. So XSDs are basically ways to describe what's in a XML definition. We're shipping some XSDs as part of Windows SharePoint services, which can be used to validate and help you edit the SharePoint XML files you're going to need to create. Things like onet.xml or feature.xml or elements.xml. So Alex's project, the project he's working on with a bunch of folks, that will install those XSDs by default into the right place so that Visual Studio can just know that they exist and use them. But in the meantime, you're going to need to add these to your Visual Studio projects so that you get the IntelliSense from them. And I'll show you a little bit about that. OK, so a little bit about the tool. So first thing to keep in mind is that Windows SharePoint Services does a lot of caching. As you use onet.xml or as you use feature.xml, Windows SharePoint Services will go ahead and load those files into memory and have them available so that in a very high performance, high throughput situation, hey, those XML files are there in memory. We don't need to load them from the disk. But as a developer, this is a little bit of a pain because it means that as you deploy new XML files to the SharePoint directories, those changes won't immediately take. So for those reasons, you're going to need to do things like IIS Reset when you change the XML files that SharePoint's using. This also applies to ASPX pages. We also cache a number of those ghosted ASPX pages into memory. So if you change one on the file front end, if you've already used it, you're going to need to reset the cache so that it'll pick up your changes. We have this infrastructure that you've probably heard about by now called features. So features are modules of provisioning into SharePoint. They can contain things like files and list definitions and content types. They're basically the main way to get things into SharePoint. Now, features basically have two stages in their life cycle. They have install feature, which basically says, hey, SharePoint, this thing is now available. Go ahead and make it, show it in the user interface, expose it through the object model. And then you have activate feature and deactivate feature. Turn this feature on for a specific web application or a specific web or a specific site. So when you first develop your features, you're going to want to install them so that SharePoint knows about them. But then you're going to want to activate that on a particular site or a particular web or a particular web application. So these are some commands that you're going to need to use as you start developing your solutions. Again, with this Visual Studio Extensions infrastructure and through solution deployment, some of this will be handled for you once you get that. Now, the other thing is that you're going to develop against content. And as you go, you're going to do things like create a feature, but then maybe decide, hey, actually, I don't want these files. I want to do something else with this feature. So you're going to develop sites that need to be rebuilt over time as you iterate on your features. We generally really recommend that as you're developing your infrastructure, you do it against a development server. In fact, it's pretty much required just by virtue of the notion that you need to use the object model, you need to be on the local machine, and so therefore, the machine that you write code on is the same machine that you're testing and developing against. The other half of this is that as you develop your features, you're going to create these sites or webs that don't work quite right. So for that reason, we really recommend that as you're developing on your SharePoint site, be prepared to do things like rebuild your SP site. Basically take down your entire site collection and rebuild it again because, hey, maybe you've made a change that's fundamentally now different from what you did before, and now you want to start from a clean configuration. I guess in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is, don't run your development on sites where you've got important data. Iterate on your solutions, create them, test them. When you're done with them, take the solution packages or Windows installer files or whatever, deploy them to the production machines, but keep your development server light and nimble and make sure that you can go ahead and easily delete or recreate your solutions. So here's a couple of batch files that I tend to use when I'm actually developing solutions. The one at the top I was specifically warned to add lots of disclaimers to. This is the batch file that goes ahead and deletes your SP site. It'll basically delete essentially all the content on your development server. Now, as I mentioned, this is something that hopefully you don't need to do often, but there's times when you're developing things like content types or column templates that have global SP site scope that you start with them, you change them, and now they're sort of in a little bit of a weird state. So frequently, it's useful to go ahead and take down your SP site, start from scratch, start from a clean environment, and then go ahead and continue your development against that. So it's handy to have a batch file that allows you to take down your site, rebuild it, and move on. But just to add a caboose to that disclaimer, you want to make sure that you're using a server where the data is not important. You're just doing test data, you're doing testing against it. But nevertheless, it's an important batch file. The other thing you're going to want to do very frequently is build a web based on your template. So maybe you're developing a site definition, or maybe you're just developing a single feature. Frequently, what you're going to want to do is try and see how that thing gets provisioned into SharePoint. Tell SharePoint, that, hey, go ahead and create a site based on this template, and then go and add a feature to it. So frequently, you're going to want to have a batch file that goes ahead and deletes any existing site at a particular location. In this example, HTTP localhost/test, and then goes ahead and creates a new instance of the site template that you're developing. In this case, the help desk application that I was working on for this particular set of demos. When it's done, there's a line in there called start HTTP localhost/test. This basically will open up Internet Explorer, or I guess the default browser that's installed on your machine, and point it at that site that's just been created. So frequently, as I'm iterating on onet.xmls, for example, you iterate. OK, let's try and see if that works. Let's see what that looks like. OK, call the new web batch file. It'll go ahead and create a new site. Now, these are just batch files, I should also mention, but there's actually higher level tools, better tools available out in the community. There's infrastructure like Nant, which allows you to go ahead and create build processes and build structures and build tools that are available. There's community Nant SharePoint tasks that allow you to structure a more robust build environment than just batch files. But for simplicity, I just like to use batch files. For something more industrial strength, you'll want to check out those alternatives. Now, this is the batch file that I had for doing my entire help desk sample. So my help desk sample, I had about 3 features. I had a site definition. I had some control templates. And you can see that this is really a mix of copying files from my build directory into SharePoint, doing things like copying layout files and control templates to the right places. Basically, it's just a big build script that copies all the stuff I've been developing that maybe exists in my source depot, in my source control system, copying them over into the SharePoint directories. And you'll notice that this is all wrapped in an IIS_reset/stop and an IIS_reset/start because, hey, I'm updating all these XML files. Chances are they've been cached, but I want to go ahead and try them out and see what effect it has. Do an IIS reset around that. Just an example of copying them. OK. So we also have this infrastructure in Windows SharePoint Services v3 for validating XML. And to do this, we use XSD files. So by default, we have XSDs for our SharePoint core schemas, things like onet.xml, feature XML, all of the element types, web temp, etc. These are contained in WSS12.xsd and WSS.xsd. These XSDs inherit from other XSDs like Camel Query and Camel View, which define the XML schemas for those respective types of XML structures you can use. So things like, if you want to build a Camel View, you're going to want to look at all those tags in camelview.xsd. Now, when you go through and actually install a feature into SharePoint, we're going to try to actually validate those XML files you provide us to make sure that you're not providing XML that just won't work with SharePoint. So these XSDs are used to go ahead and validate the files that you're trying to install into SharePoint. Now, one caveat is there's been a couple of cases in Beta 1, for example, and I'm sure there's a couple of cases in Beta 1 TR where our XSDs are not perfect. So sometimes you'll get an install feature error that says, hey, this is not valid, and maybe you are actually convinced that we messed it up and it's not right. So there might be a bug in the XSDs that might require you to work around that by editing the XSDs. But we're working to get rid of as many of those bugs as possible. Just want to offer that caveat. Now, the other great thing about XSDs is that you can provide them to Visual Studio to get some IntelliSense out of that. For debugging, if you're actually writing code and want to try and debug that code, you can go ahead and basically in Visual Studio go to Tools, Attach Processes, and attach to the w3wp.exe process. That will basically go ahead and hook up Visual Studio so that if your breakpoint gets hit, you'll go ahead and have a call out. You may need to copy the PDBs into your global assembly cache directory. PDBs are basically these symbol files which contain information about how to debug your DLLs. You can basically copy those into the C Windows assembly and then the path to your strong name assembly, and that will get you enhanced debugging support in some scenarios. And finally, if you're actually doing things like creating onet.xml or feature.xml and you're provisioning files into SharePoint, sometimes you'll get errors that aren't covered by the XSDs, random errors like cannot complete this action. Who's seen that one? Yeah. Cannot complete this action. Well, you know what? We do actually a lot of times have a better error message that describes what SharePoint was doing or what it was thinking when you got that error message. And those are stored in our log files in 12/logs. So if you actually do a DR, if you actually look at the log files in there, what you'll see is a bunch of log files. I think we start a new one every half an hour, and the latest sort of trace of what SharePoint was doing will be available in those log files. Okay, so now I'm going to show you just a very basic, very simple example of doing some development using some of these techniques I've mentioned on top of SharePoint. Again, a lot of this will look a lot better once the tools are out, but I also want to leave a little bit of a, sort of a framework for folks to get started. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and start with Visual Studio. So I'm running Visual Studio on my development machine. So, hey, I've got a SharePoint site here, but the data in there is not important. It's available for me to go ahead and debug against. So I'll go ahead and start a new project. All right, let me get the mouse set up. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and just select an empty project type. And I'm just going to call this, Microsoft Office DevCon and get that started. Now, what I want to do is basically build a page that can get provisioned into SharePoint. I just want to build a simple HTML page that uses the feature infrastructure to go ahead and put that into SharePoint. So step one is I'm going to be creating some XML, and I really would like to get some XSD validation as I go ahead and create those files. So what I'm basically going to do is going to right-click on my solution node and go ahead and add those XSDs into my project. Now, I actually have the XSDs at C SharePoint XSDs. These are basically copied from the 12/template/XML directory. But because I want to add a reference to these in my Visual Studio project, you don't want to go against those XSDs directly. You want to make a copy first and go ahead and add them. So as you'll notice, we have a number of XSD files here. We have those XSDs I mentioned. We also have XSDs under the deployment namespace as well. And these actually cover all of our file formats around serializing data into and out of SharePoint. So we basically have our own file format that gets exported from SharePoint. These are the XSDs that describe it. But I'm just going to go ahead and add these, add a number of these into my solution project. So I accidentally just selected one and added it, but I'll add the other ones. So basically what it'll do is it'll add it into this bucket called solution items, and then they'll be available in my project. So let me go back to that directory. Let me just go ahead and select these. Let's see. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and add these to the project. Now, unfortunately, as I add these to the project, Visual Studio won't immediately know that these XSDs exist and won't be able to do the validation. So unfortunately, this is a little bit goofy, but I'm going to go ahead and save this project out and close it and reopen it. Okay, and so now I'm ready to go, and my XSD validation should work. So now I'm actually ready to go ahead and create my solution. I'll go ahead and collapse this node so that hide the XSDs. And I'll go ahead and add an XML file into my project. Excuse me. So I'm going to say right-click and add new item. I will select an XML file here, and I will go ahead and call that thing feature.xml because I'm adding a feature into SharePoint. And now I'll go ahead and just get started creating my XML. So this is going to use a feature tag, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a namespace, schemas@microsoft.com/SharePoint. This is the namespace that contains all of our out-of-the-box definitions and infrastructure. Okay? So let's see. Okay, so let me just go ahead and close this. Okay? Let's see. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and start developing with this. The first thing you need to do when you actually develop your feature is create a GUID for it. All features have a GUID, so basically, as you go ahead and edit it, you need to give your feature a new GUID, and so that's done through a tool called GUIDgen. Now, GUIDgen is part of the .NET framework as well, and I'll go ahead and use that and create a new GUID. Okay, I'll go ahead and put that into there. Okay, and just get rid of the curly braces, and now that's basically identifying my identifying my solution. Okay, so the other thing I'm going to do is give this a particular scope. Now, basically, I'm going to scope this at the web level. So basically, what this says is, hey, this particular feature will only work for activating the feature at the web level. Let's see. Now, the odd thing is that the actual IntelliSense does not seem to be working, unfortunately. Let me just go ahead and open up a separate project that I created earlier that should have this. Okay. So basically, as you go ahead and type, you'll see things like, as you add new elements to your feature XML, it'll go ahead and add new attributes. It'll show you what's possible to use by creating that particular feature. So, for example, for the feature tag, when you have the XSDs properly installed, unlike that other project I was doing, you'll go ahead and see, okay, here's the list of tags you can create and go ahead and add into your feature XML. So I'll just go ahead and just wanted to show you a little bit of what that looks like when you actually add the particular nodes into your solution. Okay, so let me just go back to the other project real quick. Okay. So the other thing that my feature is going to need is a title. So I'm just going to give this a simple title of Microsoft Office, DevCon, my simple feature there. Now, every feature is going to need an element manifest. This basically describes the set of things that are actually in the feature itself in terms of functionality. So I'm going to say, okay, element manifest location is equal to elements.xml. This basically says, okay, there is a file called elements.xml, which will contain all the things that will actually get provisioned into the site. Okay, so basically I've defined my feature here. I've given it a title. I've given it a scope. And it should be pretty much good to go from here. Now I'll go ahead and add my elements file. Again, this will be another XML file I add to the project. And I'll call that elements.xml. And what I'm going to do here is basically provision a page. So I'll go ahead and say elements and xmls equals, again, that SharePoint namespace. And from here, I'll go ahead and add a module tag. The module tag is basically what goes ahead and says, here's a set of files that need to get provisioned into SharePoint. So again, I'll just give this a name. And I'll say, okay, by the way, the path where you should take these files from is the same path that this file's in, so just leave that empty. And I'll say provision this into the root of the SharePoint web that you're provisioning this into. And then I'll basically add a file called simplepage.htm, which basically will have a simple bit of content in it. I'll say type equals ghostable. Which is basically says, okay, provision this file, make it one of those ghosted files that lives inside of SharePoint. So basically, I'm done defining my feature, and I can go ahead and add a file here called simplepage.htm, which is the thing that will get provisioned into SharePoint. So go ahead and add that. Let me rename that to simplepage.htm. And that's the thing that's going to get provisioned. So I'll just say, hello, DevCon in there. OK, so now we're into the second phase of this debugging, this solution creation process. I've gone ahead and I've actually created my solution. The IntelliSense wasn't quite working right, but other than that, I've got my solution all ready to go. And so what I can do here is basically now go ahead and start creating some batch files. So the first thing I want to do is, OK, I want to go into my, my directory that I've created and start working with these features. Now, every feature basically lives in its own subdirectory inside of the 12/template/features directory. And so this is going to be no exception. I'm going to want to go ahead and create a subdirectory for those things. So I'll go ahead and create that subdirectory called, Moss DevCon, which is basically becomes the name of my feature. And I'll go ahead and move all these things that I've created into it. And now from here, I can go ahead and take that directory, which serves as my feature directory, and go ahead and build some scripts that will go ahead and deploy that to SharePoint. So first I'm going to do is write a batch file called deploy.cmd, which basically will take these files and deploy them to SharePoint. Now inside of deploy.cmd, I want to first of all set the path to the SharePoint directory, so I have that handy and available. Let me just copy that out. So basically what this will do is it will set an environment variable which points at the SharePoint directory. I want to go ahead and stop the IS reset because I'm going to be copying some files into SharePoint. I'll go ahead and use xcopy to copy that folder I've created to the SharePoint area into the features directory, like that. And then now that I'm done copying these things, I want to go ahead and start up IIS again. So this will basically deploy things from my project directory into SharePoint. So it'll stop IIS, copy the files over, and that's pretty much all it will do. Now the next thing I want to do is go ahead and create a tool that will go ahead and install the feature into SharePoint. Basically, go ahead and make this available so that SharePoint knows about it. And to do that, I need to use the sds-adm-o command, install feature, and give it the name of a feature that I'm interested in. In this case, it's Moss DevCon. Again, that's because the folder that I created is called Moss DevCon. So I'll go ahead and do that. So I'll go ahead and run this command. And again, I'm putting these into batch files so that as a developer, as I go ahead and work with these, they're available for me to run and rerun as I iterate, as I change things, and as I do things. OK. And now the other thing I want to do is go ahead and write a batch file called activate feature. This basically says, go ahead and turn on this particular feature for my particular site. So I'll go ahead and use sds-adm-o activate feature. I'll say use that Moss DevCon feature, and then go ahead and activate that at the root of my site, HTTP localhost. So this will basically go ahead and activate that feature. OK? One other thing I want to do real quick is I actually want to change the name of this, just because I think I probably provisioned a file earlier called simple page, so I'll just call this Moss DevCon and change the name of this. OK. So now I'm pretty much done. Now I'm going to go ahead and redeploy this. Oop. Let me go ahead and save that. I didn't save it. I'm sorry. Let's save all these files, by the way. I'll go ahead and deploy this again, run that batch file that I wrote earlier. I'll go ahead and install the feature again, just to make sure that SharePoint knows all about it. And then I'll go ahead and excuse me. Then when I activate the feature, it will go ahead and provision it. Now again, what it'll do is it'll actually validate it as I go ahead and pass that in. And basically it says, OK, line 6, character 11, the name attribute is not declared. OK, I accidentally missed the capitalization of this. I need to use a capital N. So just to show that as you actually try to use your features in SharePoint, we'll go ahead and validate it. OK? One more time, I'll go ahead and deploy those files back out to SharePoint. I'll go ahead and activate the feature. I've already installed it, so I don't really need to go ahead and reinstall it now that I've installed it once. And then I'll go ahead and try that out. So if this works right, you basically should see that, okay, at the root of my site, there's now a file there called, mosdevcon. So I'll go to the root of my server and just mosdevcon.htm. And basically what you should see is that this file got provisioned into SharePoint using this feature that I've just built. So while that's loading, basically it gives you a little bit of a feel for creating XML files in a Visual Studio project. The IntelliSense, I've tried it a number of times. I've tried it a lot of times, and it's working pretty good. I'm not sure quite what happened in this instance. And I've basically gone ahead and created some batch files to go ahead and work with my feature and get them into SharePoint. So this is my HTML page. It just says hello DevCon. And so that's just a simple example of, okay, creating a feature that provisions a file using Visual Studio in about 5 or so minutes. Okay. So with that, just moving on. So that's the basics of creating a SharePoint solution now that we have that's available for you. You can use Visual Studio. Longer term, we'll have these Visual Studio extensions. Now, when it comes to actually understanding all of SharePoint, the big question is, how do I really get started with SharePoint? Where do I go, and what do I need to do to actually get my particular solution into SharePoint? We realize that a lot of customers, and a lot of internal folks too, have a hard time knowing exactly all of the pieces in SharePoint and how you go about putting all of them together. So we're taking a number of steps to document and to try to better explain how SharePoint works, all the pieces, and how they all hang together. We're doing things like creating platform maps, which will be available a little bit later on down the line, to explain all the various components and how they all work together. We're also doing things like trying to lay out, okay, for the various scenarios that you have, what technologies are available for you to get your job done. One of the things you'll see as a recurring theme in SharePoint is that there's a number of fundamental divisions that come into play when you're thinking about your project. One of these is, do I need to make changes to a single instance of a site? Or do I want to create a template that can apply to many, many, many sites? If you want to create a single instance or edit a single instance, we have tools like SharePoint Designer that allow you to open up, for example, HTTP, my company's intranet portal, and go ahead and edit the pages there, customize the pages there, and basically all do it against SharePoint in the content database. So SharePoint Designer becomes your tool. The web browser becomes your tool. Various things for customizing your site are available. If you want to do things like change the look and feel of that site, you can go ahead and edit that master page and go ahead and customize it. Now, when you actually get into something a little bit more advanced, if you want to actually create a template that can be used on many, many sites, that's really when you start to get outside of the realm of SharePoint Designer and more into the realm of using Visual Studio, creating those XML files like I mentioned, basically going ahead and editing those things. So for doing things like creating web parts, you can go ahead and use server-side code to do them. You can basically use Visual Studio to create all those types of things. Another pivot in your project often becomes, when I'm developing something, can I deploy code to the server, or do I have to do everything through the content database? And again, we're trying to come up with charts and diagrams that better explain, okay, if you want to do something that requires no code deployment, here's all the limitations you do have versus all the limitations you don't have. So this slide is basically, just a summarization of the attempts that we're making internally to better summarize and explain all the various technologies that we have inside of SharePoint. But Randall will come up and talk a little bit more about the documentation that we're producing that will contain all of these things, the process we're going about creating it, and what improvements you can expect to see.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So thanks also for sticking around, and it's late on a day before a fun event. So thanks for sticking around. So I'm gonna talk just a quick bit about what we've done to enhance the SDKs this time around. In V2, for a lot of these things, we know that there were some shortcomings in the documentation, and we really we worked very hard to try and address those customer concerns and all the things that we were hearing through feedback about this. And we really feel like we've got a strong content offering this time around. So one of the key tenets for our SDKs this time around was to get more content out early. We've already had drops to TAP customers, Beta 1 and Beta 1 technical refresh customers. So those of you who are in the beta program, go ahead and check on Beta Place. There's a refreshed SDK up there. Another thing we know that's very important this time around is the Visual Studio help integration. So I'm going to show you in a minute the integrated SDK from within the Visual Studio help environment that really helps you look at things alongside of ASP.NET and look at things alongside of all your other important documentation. The other thing that we really heard loud and clear was that more how-to topics, more code samples. We've got about 150 how-to and walkthrough topics that we've got ready for beta 2, and they're actually very strong, and I think we've been getting a lot of positive feedback on that. The other thing we've been doing is really prioritizing the things that we anticipate folks will use more, and we're going to also prioritize things like new features that you really need to get your head wrapped around, like content types and enterprise content management. And we've really got some in-depth documentation with information graphics that really help explain those concepts. So let's take a look at the SDK now. All right. So this is our first build of the SDK, and this is actually a number of SDKs from within the Visual Studio Help Viewer. So you can see we've got Office SharePoint Server, we've got Windows SharePoint Services, we've got InfoPath Forms Server, and we've got Project Server in this case. So I'm just going to go and give you like sort of the top 10 things that I love about the SDK in Visual Studio. First of all, you'll see we've got this filtered for Office development right now. So you can actually narrow your focus and look at your Visual Studio tools for Office in addition to the Office SharePoint Server stuff. We've also got our language filter that you can set. So if you just want to look at Visual Basic and C#, you can do that, and that'll persist across everything. We're using the same tools as Visual Studio, so you're really going to see consistent look and feel, and you're going to be able to navigate through the help files a lot easier in that regard. Another thing we've got is an index. I think we've been hearing loud and clear that the index is a really great way for people to find out what we call things and that sort of thing. So if you look at if you look at the things that are indexed here, you can really find things quickly in using that. The other thing we've got is the table of contents. I really feel is a very strong way of actually learning how to get started with development. And we've made a lot of efforts to actually break this down into things that are grouped by affinity. So, for example, integrating with enterprise applications, we've got our single sign-on and our business data catalog. The deeper you go into this content, the more you get into architecture, you get into scenarios, the metadata model, and then as you get in here further, you actually have these step-by-step walkthroughs with very complex code samples that help you understand something and get hands-on education about that part of the object model. And like I said, we've got about 150 of these how-to and walkthrough topics right now, and we're just going to keep adding and adding and adding based on what we hear from folks. So the other thing we've got is an integrated search that not only searches your local help, but also searches MSDN online. So you can actually set it to try online first and then go to local, or if you prefer to stay offline, or if you're in an offline situation, you can actually look at things locally as well. And it's also going out there and searching code zone. You can look at what other people are doing in things like .NET junkies and things like that. And then there's also the MSDN online information there. So then the other thing I really love is the help favorites. So you can actually pin things that you like, and I'm going to show you a couple things, some examples of some of the information graphics we've been doing around things like content types, the content type object models, the IRM framework. Being able to, this is a 1024 resolution, so it'll be a little bit easier to read on a bigger monitor. But basically just trying to explain these brand new concepts and get this information out to you guys in an easily consumable format. The other thing we've got going right now, we're still developing this, but there's this concept in WIDBE help about how do I do this? How do I do that? And we basically tried to aggregate these things based on nouns like how do I do things with lists? How do I do things with list events and things like that? And so as you drill down into this, you'll actually get into the actual how-to topic that will give you a very crisp, clean example that you can just copy over and put into your project. So those are kind of my, and then if you do prefer to actually stay outside of this environment, I think we're still going to be providing all of that stuff to you in chum format. So if you want to go ahead and just run the chum locally, we're going to install that for you as well. So if you're not in an environment where you have access to Visual Studio, we're going to make sure that you're taken care of as well. So I've only got about 5 minutes left, so I think one of the things I was going to do a demo of the business data catalog, but I think there's going to be a big session on that tomorrow, so I'm going to actually skip that and go back to my presentation so that I can get to the other things around the website that we really want to share with you. So, as you know, the Office Developer Center is easily accessible through msdn.microsoft.com/office. And also, to get to either the SharePoint platform in Windows SharePoint Services or to get to the Office SharePoint Server information, that will be post-beta 2. If you do WAC SharePoint, you'll go directly to a page. And I think we're still going to keep the WAC SPS redirect so that you can go directly to Office SharePoint Server. And so the goal around the Office Developer Center is to create a hub for you to be able to go and get the information you need, keep up to date on what we're doing, and also to get exposed to a community that's out there. I think that we've got a lot of bloggers out there. We've got a lot of folks on got.net. So we want to kind of bring all that together and make this the hub for where you can check in and get tools. And then that community is really going to be important for us for SharePoint as well. And I'm going to show you a preview in a minute of something. So here's a preview of the SharePoint Developer Center. And I actually have a live version of this as well. And basically what you're seeing here is we're actually doing live blog polls. This is actually from the SharePoint team blog. This is from some other folks. I think here's Fitz's blog. We've got pulled in there dynamically, and we'll be updating this stuff and talking to MVPs, and folks are getting profiles of MVPs and other things, and then trying to tell you what's new. And then for Office SharePoint Server, we're going to have information about Excel services, form services, migration, and this is all planned for beta 2. So this is what you're looking at right now. So we're really excited about that too. The other thing I wanted to demo really quickly is something called MSDN Labs. It's something that's cooking. It's just been released a few weeks ago. It's very, very tentative, but we're going to try and get this hooked up for beta 2 using SharePoint. And so what we've got here is a sign-in. Let me just do this again. And so once you get to the sign-in, there's an acceptance. And once you get there, so what they're doing is they're piloting this with the Visual Studio and the WinFX stuff. And basically, what it's allowing you to do is actually add community content in a wiki format in addition to the core documentation. So what we want to be able to do is to say, hey, I saw something in this topic that was either misleading or it was just a little bit incomplete, or maybe you have a really cool sample you want to share that's in addition to that. And so we can just actually use the wiki-like function, or it actually is a wiki functionality, and actually add information to a topic. And it's just done with this. UI down here. So so I could just do something really quick. So I'll get in trouble for this. No, I'm just kidding. But so I can actually view that on the page outside of the core content here. And if I scroll down. And so here we go. Here's Hello DevCon. So this is just one of those other things that we're trying to do to build community around the online presence. So I think we're pretty much out of time, and we have time for questions. So if you want to start lining up at the microphone.
Thank you, Randall, Mike, and Alex. Great job. So yes, in the 15 minutes remaining, please line up to ask questions. And if you want to hot-foot it out of here, I ask that you do it rather quietly so that those who still want to focus on Q&A can have that. Thank you.
do any online demos?
Online demos?
Oh, you mean like screencasts? Oh.
They have them for some of the other products, some of the platform products where you can actually go online and do, it's got like virtual server.
So you can go ahead and try it out online before you, for example, download it and install it.
Exactly.
Yes, we will.
Okay, so the answer was yes, we will.
Any other questions, or? Okay.
Well, it's your 15 minutes, fellas. If there's anything else you want to touch on,
Yeah, do you want me to do the BDC demo of adding some custom metadata? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we've got here is a walkthrough of a sample. And so for folks who haven't, I can't remember if the BDC presentation has actually happened yet. I know you've been hearing a lot about the business data catalog, but I think it's tomorrow. So basically what we're going to be doing here is showing you a walkthrough that we've documented in the SDK that works with the AdventureWorks sample database. And so basically I'm just going to show you the first couple of steps here in the walkthrough. But basically what it's going to do is we're going to create an XML file that defines our the fields that we want to query from that database, and then we're going to actually pull those fields into a web part and display that on the page. So what I've done is I've already gone ahead and installed the AdventureWorks sample database, and so then the first step is actually to create a new XML file called AdventureWorks 2000.xml. So I'm just going to go over to Visual Studio and create a new file. And so we'll call it, go ahead and call this the AdventureWorks 2000.xml. And then one of the cool things I love about the SDK is you can actually go over here and there's a copy code feature, so you don't have to spend a lot of time guessing how you're going to select everything. And you can just copy that code and put it into your XML file that you've created. And I'm just going to go ahead and save that. And then the next thing that the walkthrough tells you to do is actually go and change your AdventureWorks 2000 server name. So I'm just going to update that in my XML file. Okay, then back to the walkthrough. That's actually that's the end of step 1. So we're actually going to go on to step 2 here. And what we're going to do now is actually define those entities, methods, and filters. And I think I'm going to be able to show you the XML IntelliSense here. So hopefully it'll work for me. So basically, so right now, you can see I'm not getting XML IntelliSense because I don't have the schemas copied into my directory. But I just happen to have them. I just happen to have them in another directory here. Oh, actually, I put them on the desktop because I was thinking. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my working directory and my so in my Microsoft Office DevCon BDC demo, let me make sure I've got this saved in the right place. ODC 2006 demo. Oh, that's why. I've got it in the wrong thing here. Hang on. Here we go. It wasn't there before. So now I'm going to go ahead and paste that XSD in there. And then go back to Visual Studio. And now I'm typing I'm typing in my file, and now you can see I have that property element available to me. So if I wanted to add another property, I could right there. So that's the XSD IntelliSense that we were talking about. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the walkthrough and copy the next piece that needs to go into the XML file. And so I'll go ahead and do the copy code again. And where it says insert enter entity XML here, I'll just go ahead and do that. And so now I have my XML file written. And then I can go actually and move on to the next step, which is actually more of an IT task, but we've gone ahead and written a how-to on how to actually go in and add an application definition to the business data catalog. And so basically what we're going to do now is go to central administration, make sure my session hasn't timed out here, and then I'm basically going to go to application management. And then I'm going to go to Beta Shared Services and click Create or Configure this farm's shared service. Let me see that again. Sorry about that. This is why I'm using the documentation. So Shared Services, and then Create or Configure this farm's shared services. So what I'm going to actually do is and so then basically I select the shared service provider. And then I needed, this was expected because I actually don't, I don't have the proper rights on this machine. So I'm going to actually log in as a different user. And then going down to Business Data Catalog, I'm going to go and add an application. And then I'm going to go browse for that XML file I just created. There's my AdventureWorks 2000.xml. And go ahead and import that. And then basically we're ready to add that as a web part to a page. So I'm going to go to my site that I created earlier on this, and so basically it was successfully imported. And now if I go to my site, I'm going to go and browse around for that business data catalog web part now. And so the AdventureWorks database, for those of you who don't know about it, it's a sports. I think it's a sports store that's made up. So what I'm going to actually do, go here and edit a page. And then add a web part. And then scroll down here to the business data catalog, which is under all web parts. And basically, I think trying to figure out where it goes in there. Business data list. I think, but I think it should say AdventureWorks. So let me find this here. Just make sure I've got everything here. Okay. And I guess I must have missed a step, so I apologize for that. I'm going to go ahead and retrace this for a second. And Well, I'm not sure. So I might actually just go back and re-import that. So it might have been just a session that expired on my site. So I'll try and troubleshoot this, but I didn't want to. I don't want to keep you here. So anyway, so I'm sorry the demo didn't work, but that's what happens when you try and fly without a net. So, but as you can see, the point of the demo was just to see how the code samples are easily imported into a Visual Studio file, and so that's just the way it goes. Okay. Well, thanks very much.
On that note, why don't we go party?
Yeah.
Have a great time, guys.